What's going on, guys? It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. So I'm going to be going over about 15 players that I've been looking to involve in trades, and specifically looking to sell high on ahead of Week 9. These are players that I don't think you necessarily need to get rid of, but players that I do believe are either performing ahead of what they should be so far, or performing greater than what I expect them to go or do going forward. These are guys that either have really tough schedules going forward, guys that maybe have had some really nice touchdown luck so far, and guys that I really do expect to regress. So I think these are guys that you can definitely capitalize on their value right now and potentially sell high on. As always, there's no player that you specifically need to trade away. It's just sort of a matter of, what you can get in return, sort of gauging the market and seeing how things work in your league. So as always, if you guys have any specific trade questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. I love helping you guys navigate those trade waters and see what we can do for you guys. This will be the second video that comes out today. You guys should have been able to see the buy low video as well. There are about 25 players I talked about in that one, so make sure you guys go take a look at that one as well. It should be helpful for you guys, and hopefully it'll help sort of kickstart any sort of trade conversations you guys have. And then at the end of the video, after I talk about these like 5 main players, I'll go over players that I'm specifically looking at that are sort of more record-based, sort of league or team dependent. So sort of players that I'd be looking to sell high on to help position yourself better for the playoffs, or players that I'm maybe looking to sell high on now so that you're not really eating some really bad weeks that could come in the near future because maybe you need to start stacking some wins. So I'll explain all that as we go, but with that, let's just get into the first player. So starting things off, I'll start off with Courtland Sutton. This might be like the third week in a row that I've talked about Sutton, but I just feel like I'm obligated to bring him up again. He scored 6 touchdowns in the season so far. He saved his performance this last week with a late touchdown. He only caught 2 passes, but he had 29 receiving yards and a touchdown. Made his fantasy day a little bit more respectable, but that's sort of been the story of his season. He just keeps finding the end zone. Russ has only thrown 16 passing touchdowns this season. Courtland Sutton has 6 of those. The fact of the matter is the Broncos want to be a run-heavy team this season. I think Javonte Williams had 28 rushing attempts in this last game. Russ only attempted 5 passes beyond the line of scrimmage in the entire game. They're really just trying to play defense, run the ball, and it worked against the Kansas City Chiefs. It seems like the sort of recipe that they'll try and implement going forward. If you can get a weekly starting for Courtland Sutton, I think you definitely should do that. He's a guy that, maybe he's like a flex play going forward because he's got that touchdown upside because he does clearly have a rapport with Russ once they get near the red zone. But I'm not going to bank on those touchdowns to come. This isn't like a high-powered offense. There's going to be a lot of touchdowns to go around in, and eventually, sooner or later, the Broncos are going to rush a touchdown in as well. Javonte Williams leads the NFL in rushing attempts without a touchdown by a wide margin. That's going to change at some point going forward as well. So the touchdowns should decrease for Courtland Sutton going forward, and outside of that, the volume and the yardage just isn't enough to keep him afloat. So I'd be looking to move off of Sutton if I can. Next, we've got Ken Walker, and I talked about selling Kenneth Walker a little bit earlier in the season, even when he was performing at a much higher level, just due to how brutal this end of season schedule is for the Seattle Seahawks. They end the season with the 49ers, Cowboys, 49ers, Eagles, Titans, and Steelers. Those are 6 straight matchups against historically tough defenses that are really good against the run. The Steelers are the worst defense of that bunch, and they really just give it up through the air. They're actually relatively good against the ground, so it just makes it a really scary proposition to be rostering Kenneth Walker going forward. On top of that, we saw Zach Charbonnet outsnap Kenneth Walker this last week, 31 to 25 snaps. That could have been due to Kenneth Walker sort of missing practice due to an injury during the course of the week, so we'll see what happens there. But Charbonnet performed very well. He's a really good player, and it makes a lot of sense for the Seahawks to want to save Kenneth Walker and sort of make this a committee approach. They're in it for the playoffs going forward, and I don't think it makes sense for the Seahawks to give Kenneth Walker the workhorse role they were giving him up to this point. So I think that workhorse role for Walker could go away here, and that's going to obviously limit his upside in fantasy. This could easily become a committee backfield in a team that's probably not going to score a whole lot of touchdowns with how brutal the schedule is. So I think that if you can get running back 1 value for Kenneth Walker, get like a top 10 running back return for Kenneth Walker, maybe get a top tier wide receiver for him instead, I think that's something that I would definitely consider because I do think that the production for Kenneth Walker is going to dip going forward. I believe he's probably already peaked, probably peaked about 2 weeks ago in terms of his value, but I think that was a great time to move off of Kenneth Walker before things sort of get really hairy there in Seattle. Next up, we've got another running back that's performed really well so far this season, and that's going to be Raheem Mostert. But the real issue here is that the Dolphins just continue to employ a committee approach in the backfield. This week, even without Devon Achane there, we saw Mostert only play 56% of the snaps. Jeff Wilson received 5 carries as well. Tua ran it 6 times. Salvon Ahmed was involved as a pass catcher, and Mostert didn't catch a single pass this last week. His production's been just greatly inflated by touchdowns so far this season. I believe he scored his 9th touchdown of the year this last week, and obviously that can continue to happen in what looks to be arguably the best offense in the NFL, and we know that this Dolphins offense is elite, but the issue here is that I don't think that touchdown production is sustainable, especially when Devon Achane returns from injury in Week 11. Raheem Mostert could very quickly become the 1B at best in this offense. I think Achane pretty clearly established himself as the most explosive player in this backfield. Achane's going to be the number 1 in this offense, and anytime you're relying on a number 2 running back on any team to be the high-end producer, it's just going to be really inconsistent for you guys. Obviously, Raheem Mostert's a guy that can take any carry to the house. He could have a couple more 50 or 60-yard rushing touchdowns this season, and he will have some spike weeks. But sort of like with Walker, I think if you can get running back one value, get a high-end return for him, I think now's a good time to do that because you've got one more week. They play the Kansas City Chiefs. That should be a high octane game. You should see a lot of offense over there. And but after that happens, the Dolphins go into their bye, and then Devon Achane's going to come back. So I think it's going to be a good time to sort of cash out on Raheem Mostert. I think it's just a good time to make sure you get high-end value for him, and then avoid any sort of headache that could happen when Devon Achane returns. Next, we've got DeAndre Hopkins, and this one's pretty easy for me. And I know I get it. He scored 3 touchdowns for you, and it was probably on your bench. So now you're sort of frustrated, and you want to hope that you have something going forward. I just don't think that's going to be true. I don't think, obviously, DeAndre Hopkins hasn't looked like vintage DeAndre Hopkins. He's not the all-pro level wide receiver that he once was, and I don't think I'm going to fall for the trap of believing that Will Levis is suddenly a high-end fantasy producer at the quarterback position. There's a real chance that this ends up being Will Levis's best performance of the entire season. They play the Pittsburgh Steelers this week on Thursday. That is a beatable matchup, so I don't think I'd necessarily sit DeAndre Hopkins this week. He's a guy that I'm probably getting into my lineup, but last week, DeAndre Hopkins still only caught 4 passes. Obviously, 3 of those went for a touchdown, so it ended up being a really high-end fantasy performance for him. But he hasn't scored a touchdown all season before Week 8. I think that we're probably going to see him score, 2 or 3 more touchdowns the entire rest of the season. And this is clearly a team in Tennessee that wants to run the ball a ton with Derrick Henry and Tyjae Spears. They have other weapons outside of Hopkins and Treylon Burks and Chico Okonkwo. We saw Nick Westbrook-Akina get involved last week as well. It's not like there's going to be a complete pass funnel offense towards DeAndre Hopkins. There's not going to be a very huge passing pie to go around as well. Like I said earlier, I think they'll be probably the best performance that they get out of the quarterback position all season this year. So I think that if you can get wide receiver 2 value for Hopkins, I would definitely do that. I view him as more like a low-end wide receiver 3 the rest of the way. So if you can cash out and get a high-end value player for him, I definitely would do that right now. And the last specific player that I'll talk about here is going to be Travis Etienne. I get it. He's the running back 2 on the season. He's obviously been elite so far, but I think that it's just been a little bit unsustainable for him so far. He scored 7 touchdowns over the course of the last 4 weeks. That's just simply not going to be something that he can continue to do at that level. On top of that, we saw him roll his ankle this last week. It's obviously nothing to be concerned about. He came back in the game. They've got their bye here in Week 9, so he's going to be healthy, but he's a guy that's dealt with injury concerns over the past. He's obviously getting a ton of work in this offense. It's something that we do want to see, but I'm skeptical in terms of believing that Travis Etienne can actually hold up over the course of an entire season with that workload. And even injury aside, which I'm not going to bank on that by any means, it's just sort of a extra reason to be concerned about Etienne. The rest of the season schedule for the Jaguars is absolutely brutal. They play the 49ers and the Titans right out of the bye. Those are 2 really high-end run defenses. And after that, going into the fantasy playoffs, in the first 2 weeks of the fantasy playoffs, you're going to get a matchup against the Browns, the Ravens, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Those are 3 teams that defend the run extremely well. His matchup in Week 17 is far more acceptable, but you've got to get there, and I don't know if Travis Etienne is going to be a guy that's going to perform at a high level in those fantasy playoffs. If you're in a good spot, especially, so you don't need to really necessarily be worried about the week-to-week matchups right now. You want to be poising yourself and positioning yourself for having those high-end performances come the fantasy playoffs. I don't think Travis Etienne's your guy, so I think if you can look elsewhere and get another high-end producer here, if you can get like top 3 running back value for him, because he's the running back 2 on the season, if you can get the running back 2 overall value out of Travis Etienne, get like a running back 1 and a wide receiver 2, for example, that's something that I would do. I don't think he's going to be like a true league-winning asset for you guys. The schedule's too tough down the stretch, and obviously there are injury concerns potentially surrounding him as well. So I think if you can sell high right now, it'd be a good time to cash out on Etienne. So then here, I just want to talk about some players that I'd potentially be looking to trade away. If you've got a really good record, these are players that I've went through and looked at the strength of schedule for all the teams, sort of looked at who has good and bad fantasy playoff matchups, and I want to trade away players that have bad fantasy playoff matchups because if I'm already in a spot where I know I'm going to be in those playoffs, those are the weeks that we care about now. So if you're 6-2 or 7-1, these are players that I don't think you really want to be carrying on your roster necessarily because they've got really tough schedules come the fantasy playoffs and just probably aren't going to perform at a high level for you once that happens. I'll start off with Gus Edwards, who plays the Jaguars, the 49ers, and then the Dolphins. Those are 3 all below average defenses in terms of running back production allowed. That's certainly not something that we're excited about come the fantasy playoffs. We know Gus Edwards is coming off of that 3 touchdown game, so it's a good opportunity to sell high on him as well. So if you could do that with Gus Edwards, I would definitely look to do that. After that, I want to bring up the Dolphins offense. I know it's tough to sell high on any of those guys. I know that Tyreek Hill's obviously been like the leading scorer across all positions in fantasy football so far. You're not necessarily looking to sell high on Tyreek Hill or really necessarily anybody in this Dolphins offense, but I just want to point out that their fantasy playoff schedule involves playing the Jets, the Cowboys, and then the Ravens. Those are 3 really tough defenses, so we do need to keep that in mind. We might not see any of those like boom production weeks for this team. It could be a rough stretch here. So if you guys have a lot of Dolphin exposure, I might want to consider sort of just getting out of that a little bit. If you can get equal value players on different teams, it might be time to just take a look at that. After that, I'm going to bring up Saquon Barkley. His fantasy playoff schedule is really brutal. They play the New Orleans Saints, Philadelphia Eagles, and Los Angeles Rams. Those are three teams that defend the run really well, especially those first two matchups against the Saints and Eagles. Obviously, Saquon can be involved as a pass catcher as well, but we don't really know what this Giants team is going to look like at this point in time. There is obviously a cause for concern with this entire team potentially imploding. Obviously, Saquon's in a contract year. It's not like he's just going to roll over and let them bench him or anything. The Giants don't have really any incentive to potentially bench Saquon down the stretch, but there is concern with how this could play out for Saquon. Obviously, it's a really brutal matchup. I know Saquon is going to be a high-end performer throughout the rest of the season because of that volume for him, but he's going to need 25 to 30 touches a week if you want him to perform at a super high level going forward. And if you can get off of him now and get a really high-end player from a similar position, I think I would consider doing that just because of how brutal that schedule is. And then I'll bring up Amari Cooper as well. I just wanted to throw a receiver in here. They finished the fantasy season with the Texans and then the Jets in the fantasy championship. Amari Cooper's not going to be a guy that I'm comfortable starting in week 16 or 17 this season unless Deshaun Watson somehow comes back and ends up performing at a high level, which I don't really see happening here. So if you can get out of Amari Cooper, if you can get wide receiver 2 value for him, I think it'd just be a good time to do that. And then last, I want to talk about some players that I've been looking to trade away if you have a bad record. These are players that, again, I looked at the strength of schedule for the next several weeks for each of these teams and sort of just took a look at which players are going to have bad matchups over the next month in general. If you're sitting at 2-6 or 1-7, you're at a point where you basically need to be winning out here. So if you have players with really bad matchups over the next few weeks, you just can't really be having those on your team because you don't want to put yourself in a spot where you lose the next couple games because then your season's over and it doesn't matter if things turn around. So I'll start things off with Jalen Hurts. I know it's obviously really tough to sell Jalen Hurts. He's the quarterback 1 overall in the season. They play the Cowboys, though, this week. That's a tough matchup, and they have a bye, so he's not helping you there. Then they play the Chiefs, a good defense, the Bills, a good pass defense, the 49ers, and the Cowboys again. So over the next 6 weeks, you're dealing with nothing but really tough matchups for Jalen Hurts. I understand that Jalen Hurts is potentially a matchup-proof player. These are all teams that can score a lot of points as well, so you could see the Eagles get themselves in some shootouts. So it's not exactly something that I'm scared about. I think that Jalen Hurts might trump those matchups, but I just wanted to point it out as well. If you're sitting at 2-6 and you have Jalen Hurts, I could see myself considering trading Jalen Hurts for a lower tier quarterback, trade him for Joe Burrow plus a wide receiver 2 or something like that. Because if you're 2-6 with Jalen Hurts, you probably have holes elsewhere in your roster. So if you want to consider downgrading at quarterback position, getting yourself an extra starter on your roster, I could see yourself doing that. So just keep that in mind. Jalen Hurts doesn't need to be untouchable if you're really struggling so far this season. Up next, I got another running back I'll talk about. It's going to be Alexander Mattison. They play the Atlanta Falcons and the New Orleans Saints over the next 2 weeks. Those are two really brutal matchups for opposing running backs. And on top of that, Alexander Mattison is ceding snaps to Cam Akers. And beyond that, they just lost Kirk Cousins. We're going to see a lot of turmoil in this Vikings locker room, and their offense in general is just going to struggle so far, or going forward for the next couple of weeks, where they sort of find their identity under Joshua Dobbs. Could be a rough sledding for the next couple of weeks for the Vikings, so I can't see myself ever trusting my Alexander Mattison in my starting lineup over the next couple of weeks, and then you maybe have to play him. I think I have one team out of my 7 that I might have to play him in. I just really don't like it, so if you can get out of Mattison, if you can get even low-end running back 2 value, I think I would consider doing that right now. I also just want to mention Christian McCaffrey here. I get it. Obviously, he's been the running back 1 so far in the season, so it's really hard to consider yourself trading him away. But note, this is only if you have a really bad record right now. So if you have Christian McCaffrey and you're somehow 1-7 or 2-6, you clearly have a lot of holes in your roster. So I'm saying you would trade CMC for a package of several other players, because if you have CMC and you're struggling, like I said earlier, you have a lot of holes in your starting lineup. Otherwise, you'd be winning more games. So if you have Christian McCaffrey, I just want to bring up their next 6 weeks. They have a bye this week, so McCaffrey's not going to help you there. They play the Jaguars, who are a plus run defense. They're solid. They play the Buccaneers, who are really great. Seahawks are above average. The Eagles, who are one of the best defenses in the NFL against the run, and the Seahawks again. So you got 6 straight negative weeks for CMC. Obviously, CMC is another player who might be matchup proof, but he's probably not going to give you that high-end Christian McCaffrey production over the next weeks, especially in some of those tough matchups against the Bucs and the Eagles. Those are specifically scary. So in the next 4 or 5 weeks, you're going to have 2 or 3 weeks where you're just really not getting high-end production from CMC. You'll probably still get running back 1 production, but if you can get, I don't know, a high-end running back 1 and a high-end wide receiver 2 or something like that, it's definitely something that I would consider, because CMC is a player that obviously he's a world beater. He's a huge difference maker for you guys, but he's going to struggle a little bit over the next month or so. And if you're 1-6, 2-7, 1-7, 2-6, 3-5, even with CMC, you clearly have some holes in your roster. So you just need to maybe consider moving him. And then I'll just bring up the Raiders pass catchers as well. I did mention Davante Adams as a buy low in the previous video, but I wanted to preface that with that being only if you're in a position where you can potentially eat a couple of bad weeks going forward. The Raiders play the Giants, who are a decent pass defense, but they've been a lot better lately. And they played the Jets as well, who are the best defense in the NFL at limiting fantasy production to opposing wide receivers. It's going to be a rough next couple weeks potentially for Davante Adams and Jacoby Myers. It's not something that I'd be super excited about. So like I said, if you're 2-6, 3-5, or even worse with either Jacoby Myers or Davante Adams, I could certainly see myself considering to move off of those guys right now. So that'll do it for the Week 9 Sell High video. Up next tomorrow morning, you guys will get the Thursday Night Football primer, where I'll go over the Thursday Night Football matchup between the Tennessee Titans and the Pittsburgh Steelers, sort of get you guys primed for what to expect in that game. Saturday morning, you guys will get the video where I go over every single matchup in Week 9 and sort of which players should and shouldn't be in your fantasy football lineups on every single team, so you'll get as much information as I can possibly give you on this week's matchups. And then Sunday morning, you guys will get the Sunday morning live stream 1 hour before the early morning games kick off. That's where I'll go over last-minute injury updates, any sort of last-second sit questions you have, and really just sit there and help answer you guys' questions, get you guys as informed as possible, and get your lineup set so that you can dominate in Week 9. So if you want to make sure you don't miss any of that, just make sure you subscribe to the channel. We just broke 900 subscribers. I'd love to hit 1,000 by the NFL season, so just check, make sure you're subscribed. If you're not, I know a lot of you guys watch these videos and for whatever reason aren't subscribed. Just subscribe if you're a regular viewer. Even if you're not a regular viewer, become a regular viewer by subscribing. If you like the video, please subscribe to the channel. Like the video, give it a thumbs up as well. It helps with the algorithm, helps you know I'm doing a good job and all that. So I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch these videos. I hope you find them helpful. As always, if you guys have any specific questions or comments, feel free to let me know in the comments section below. I'll be happy to get back to you and help sort of get you guys as ready as possible and as set as possible to win in Week 9 and forward. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch the video, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.